In February of 2015, I was invited to the Greenwich, Connecticut chapter of the YMCA to give a brief talk of my choice to commemorate Martin Luther King Jr. Day. Greenwich is an extraordinarily wealthy and predominantly white town in Connecticut. This YMCA was a far cry from similar institutions I grew up around the Lower East Side of Manhattan. To my eyes, it looked practically like a private country club. Thus, with literally two exceptions, the entirety of my audience was white. Well, in any case, they figured they'd reach out to a Yale professor, which I was at the time, as they typically have done before for the holiday, and get him or her to come and say something brief and pleasant and hopeful, supposedly in the spirit of that good man, Martin. I had 15 minutes to say my piece, after which I would be handed a very modest check. Everyone would feel good about the night, especially the two high school students there to receive an award alongside my talk, and then go home. Well, they clearly did not know who they were bringing into their idyllic midst. Don't get me wrong, I love Martin as much as the next person, but everyone thinks that because Martin is supposed to be loved and is institutionally approved to be loved, they love him in the same way I do. I can only say that I love him for the burden of hope that he bore with great dignity and the quiet rage he never let anyone see, save through the grace of his virtuous speech acts. On that evening, I felt the best way I could honor him would not be channel him, but rather Frederick Douglass. In particular, I modeled my brief talk after What to the Slave is the 4th of July, in which Douglass vigorously and openly accuses his white audience members of being hypocrites that ought to be ashamed of the ways they violate the ideals of American democracy by either actively oppressing blacks or by doing nothing in the face of that unjust oppression, all the while celebrating American liberty. My own talk was titled, What to the Black American is Martin Luther King Jr. Day? And I sought to honor Martin by calling into question the character of white Americans, especially liberals, with their feelings of do-gooding and black people-loving that they are happy to cultivate because they live 3 miles closer to a black neighborhood than their conservative counterparts, but still live 5 miles away in any case. You know, the ones that have a black friend. Apparently, something in my talk misfired. When I got off stage, an older white gentleman came up glad-handing me and pumping my arm with great vigor and enthusiasm and said this: "Don't be so down. Things are nowhere near as bad as they used to be." This was the first sentiment he thought fit to shape my share, despite my talk following closely on the shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, in which his testimony, Darren Wilson described Brown as more beast than human. My talk also followed the strangling murder of Eric Garner, caught on video for the world to see, a crime for which the offending police officer Daniel Pantaleo was nevertheless exculpated. Now, here was this man telling me I was being too somber, that even though I live in a society that continues to devalue black life in such horrifying ways, I should really be chipper about the whole thing. This man held his position as fact. I could and can only hold it as one of hope, envisioning the possibility for a nation to achieve greatness, while those like me continue to pay various costs, including with their lives. Moreover, blacks not only have to form that vision, but work towards it with meager social support to sustain the effort. That is our burden, and that is what I want to try and make vivid for you in our time together today. My lecture for you in this afternoon is part of a series I have had the good fortune to present over the course of a few years, titled Black Love and Black Rage in America. In fact, today's is the third installment, and I must say a few words about the line of thinking that informs today's talk. Part one of the series, subtitled The Well-Being of Our Emotions, reflect on philosophical arguments in favor of seeing emotions as integral to rational thinking and deliberation, a view that had been held off by some philosophical schools, especially the Kantians, for quite some time. On my view, to feel and reason from anger is one legitimate way to respond to conditions in the world. I then made the argument that given the especially sharp edge of centuries-long racial injustice that continuously places obstacles in the way of black flourishing, anger is an especially rational response to life in America. But I argued that love also has to be part of blacks' affective makeup, not for the sake of white redemption, but for the sake of holding on to our own humanity. Our humanity is too often denounced and denied by others for us to also put it to the side. The second lecture, The Meaning of the Blues, engaged the ethos of blues music alongside reflections on James Baldwin to explore the resources for Black resilience in the face of sometimes overwhelming odds. In that lecture, I wasn't so much concerned with the artistry of blues music, but rather the perspective on the world it often seems to take up, as well as perspective it often seems to encourage its listeners to take up. It is worth noting at this point that my vocation is normative theory. Normative theory is typically concerned with what people ought to do. It is bland to note that people do not always act as they ought to. The more essential thing for me to note is that normative theory would not make any sense as a field of inquiry, as a way of thinking, if it weren't plausible that at least some of the time persons and institutions could act better than they do. That is to say, if it weren't possible for them to act in morally agreeable ways when it really counts. So, in a way, it is a field that necessarily embodies something like hope. But my concern here is more than academic. It really has to do with the position a person takes up or should take up or shouldn't take up when facing deep and persistent, sometimes murderous injustice. It is my duty as an academic to render this question in a more intellectual manner, but I will try to do so without sacrificing what is really at stake. That said, I ought to inform you that my lecture this afternoon is the least academic of the three. I will trot out no quotes and there are no citations. It's just you and me, seeing what we might be able to make sense of. In that regard, it might nevertheless be the most philosophical of the series. My central argument is that hope for Blacks under conditions of racial injustice as we know, observe, witness, and understand, is a burden. Here, I don't mean hope globally. When I speak of hope as a burden for a Black American, I mean specifically, yet capaciously, of the hope for a racially just and genuinely inclusive democratic society. I will call this the American hope, and my position is that it is one heavy enough to justifiably call into question the sustainability of Black support for American democracy as it's currently practiced. I won't have much to say about the kinds of actions Blacks ought to take to either redeem their hope or to express their discontent when their hopes are dashed, nor how we might think about the justifiability of various kinds of actions, like rioting, save in passing. My main concern is to shed light on the ethical questions that precede such considerations. Let's begin with some basic preliminary observations. The idea of hope is often considered, it seems to me, a very useful and important feature of human life. Without hope, we might not move past obstacles that impede our flourishing, hence we might not readily envision or imagine how the effort could be worthwhile. Without hope, we might not take the chance to tell someone that we love them, since we might prefer the safety of loneliness rather than the uncertainty of being spurned. Without hope, we might not master a new skill, since failure can be painful, thus to be avoided, even if the alternative is the mundane and familiar tick-tocking of our life as usual. Hope, then, is a feature of our personal makeup that orients us towards the future in two ways. First, it sets up expectations that something could happen. Second, the expectation is one with a positive valence. The world would be in a better state if the hoped-for thing were to come to pass. I have more to say about the particulars of hope, but they will be more vivid if we first consider another idea that is sometimes used interchangeably or thought close cousin of hope, and that is the idea of faith. Faith does not apply exclusively to matters of spirituality or religion, but the idea is most familiar in that context, so we'll work from there, bearing in mind that there are secular analogs to what follows. When someone says that they have faith in God or gods, or they have faith in divine power or powers that will the world to be one way rather than another, she's taking a very interesting stance towards the world. That person is developing or deploying a judgment of certainty in the absence of particular kinds of knowledge. If we are speaking about the faith in divine beings, the kind of knowledge that is uncertain is phenomenal. No one ever has been able, nor do I think will anyone ever be able to prove that a god or gods exist. That is not a knock against faith. It just seems to me to be a fairly clear and necessary condition of divine faith. Similarly, if a person expresses faith about why the world is one way rather than another, or will be one way rather than another, then the uncertain knowledge is causal, an analytic inability to verifiably explain why the world is the way it is, other than saying, because God wants it that way. What makes faith interesting as it stands towards the world is that uncertainty is transformed into certainty by dint of asserting the grounds for that faith. That is not to say that faith is always poorly grounded. Rather, it is to say that the grounds of faith can often themselves be murky, but that this will often have little impact on the article of faith. But there is something even more interesting about faith. Indeed, to my mind, the most crucial thing about faith is that claims made from faith can only rarely be confounded. That is to say, faith can rarely be shown to be held without warrant, even when one considers the faith being held as sensible. The reason is simple. Faith does not necessarily track facts about the world the way hope does. Thus, if one loses faith, it is an abandonment of one's assertive stance rather than a genuine betrayal of the rational order of things. Now, you are probably thinking that can't quite be right, that people's faith can be confounded since things can happen to a person that compels her to say, my faith is shaken, or I've lost my faith. This is true. Something can happen that compels a person to lose her faith. Maybe a particularly odious set of events transpires, like genocide, for example, that makes the person wonder how any God could let thousands of people die so miserably and for no good reason at all. But notice what has happened here. This person might take this kind of event as a reason for giving up belief, but in fact, the reality of genocide is no more reason for taking that as proof of God's non-existence than taking the wondrous and exhilarating fact that humans have developed the technology to travel into space as proof of God's existence. The evil that people can commit, as well as the wonder we can introduce into the world, are flip sides of the same coin of humanity. No, a loss of faith isn't a confounding of one's reasoned judgment of the world. It is rather the abandoning of an assertive stance towards that world. At one moment, one's belief system standardly serves to act as an authoritative source of epistemic and predictive grounding, but changes in circumstances cast doubt on the integrity of that grounding rather than challenging one's prior knowledge of the world directly. The distinction between faith and hope then will be easier to see, I think. Recall that hope is future-oriented and has a positive valence. The world will be in a better state if the hoped-for thing were to come to pass, or if the hoped-for outcome were to become an actuality. Though future-oriented, a properly grounded hope is importantly attendant to some facts of the world. I have gone on a job interview, was well prepared, I meet the criteria of the job posting, presented myself in an excellent fashion, and developed a good rapport with the interviewer. I have good grounds for hoping to secure the job, since many facts in the world correspond with what would need to be true to secure a job. If I do not do these things, but nonetheless am positively future-oriented, I could be said to be merely wishing or dreaming for the job. But this is the tricky thing about hope. While it must appropriately attend to facts in the world to avoid being mere wishing, it also cannot be hindered by those facts in desiring a particular state of affairs. On the other side, the person who hopes is distinctly aware that the assertive certainty of faith is a poor fit for her. Why is that? This is important. The person who hopes realizes that the world is contingent on the actions of persons, agencies, organizations, institutions, and systems that may or may not be entirely reliable, or that the interworking of these could produce something else than the hoped for outcome. That is why I say hope is a tricky business. One who hopes must strike a balance between reasoned optimism and the real possibility of being disappointed. It is clear that just because a hope is a form of reasoned optimism, that does not mean a person or persons will tend to get or achieve the hoped for thing. So why then do I think hope is a burden for blacks in a way that hope is not generally a burden for everyone else? The character of American democracy is predicated on a fairly simple slogan: life, liberty, and a pursuit of happiness. Of course, the political life of any modern society is more complex than such a slogan can let on. Yet, the slogan is not so trivial when we observe it is meant to describe the character of a liberal democracy and not that of a communist or utopian or anarchic society. That is because democracy represents a governance ethos that is meant to secure the ideal of that slogan in a particular way, specifically by recognizing persons as sources of political legitimacy. Democratic governance, among other things, is a form of governance wherein the persons over whom power is wielded are the same persons who legitimize that power in the first instance by way of various mechanisms. Again, that is not all that democracy represents, but its most significant moral duty is that of recognizing and acknowledging individual authority and autonomy as essential and morally demanding features of persons. This recognition and acknowledgement in turn underwrites the mandate to put in place laws, structures, and institutions to safeguard these features of persons. It is the moral point of entry for our Constitution to lay down inviolable laws supporting the moral demand that persons' rights be safeguarded in such a way that they have the opportunity for flourishing lives, the right to appropriately exercise their liberties, and the freedom to pursue an agreeable happiness. That is the American promise. It is more than an empty promise, as our laws are the evidence in support of that promise. Imperfect as they may be, that is their intended ethical function. Thus, any American would have good grounds to hope for a good life. Let me be clear. The appropriate hope is not that just because one is an American, one is entitled to a good life. As a parenthetical but relevant comment, this misguided but prevalent sentiment can be closely correlated with the idea of white privilege. No, the reasonable hope is not to achieve a good life by dint of being an American. Rather, it is by dint of being an American that one can begin to articulate a future-oriented disposition marked both by cautioned optimism as well as carrying with you the realistic possibility that your disposition was poorly placed, incompletely articulated, or just susceptible to misfortune and bad luck. In other words, it is by dint of being an American that one can hope to give the good life a go. Let me draw this out a little bit. The idea of the good life has been central to philosophy since the ancient Greeks, but has been especially central to the liberal tradition in the wake of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was founded on the basic idea of human responsibility for human well-being and advancement. Key to this framework were the notions of freedom, autonomy, and justification. Freedom from tyranny, autonomy to formulate one's ends as one sees fit for one's own life, and the requirement that government justify its use of state authority by seeking the legitimacy granted by the people. America's founding came directly on the heels of this change in worldview. Indeed, the founders made their case for an open revolution based on complaints such as taxation without representation and a sense of unjustly constrained self-determination. Over these ideas, a group of 13 young colonies went to war to seize the right to form a nation, to then transfer the benefits of liberal governance to its citizens. America's founding was normatively motivated by ideals of human potential that can only be met given the opportunities afforded by liberal democratic governance. That is why it is generally reasonable for Americans to hope to achieve a good life. That is our shared heritage. Now, I have made a point of emphasizing that hope strikes a balance between reasoned optimism and the potential for failure to achieve or acquire the hoped for object. Importantly, what makes it distinct from faith is that hope can be confounded and faith generally cannot. The relationship between the two ideas internal to hope, reasoned optimism and potential failure, and the external ideas of being confounded against the brief background I have provided of liberal democracy and America's ethical heritage establishes the grounds for my claim that hope is a particular kind of burden for Black Americans. Again, the hope that is at issue for us with respect to race is full inclusion and generally fair treatment of Blacks to provide an opportunity for achieving a good life alongside white Americans and under the watch of America's institutions, what I have called the American hope. At risk of being analytically crude, allow me to nonetheless keep matters straightforward by suggesting that Blacks have held the American hope in two stages. The first stage of the American hope runs from 1641, when we first see sanctioned slavery in the colonies, to 1868, when the 14th Amendment was ratified, undermining the Dred Scott decision of 1857 by declaring that all persons born or naturalized in the U.S. are citizens, including blacks. What marks this first stage of hope as distinctive is that while blacks were generally not citizens, slavery was foundational to the building of America. A new nation was not so metaphorically built on the backs of a people in the name of democracy. A people was oppressed so that another people could live free. In this first stage, naturally, blacks hoped for freedom from slavery, but they also wanted more. They wanted the arguments that underwrote the white radical action of revolting against the English crown to be applied in their favor as well. They wanted the radicalism that the founders normalized into firm tenets of civilized Western modernity to be normalized in favor of racial equality. The hypocrisy of continued black slavery alongside the vigorous pursuit of liberal Enlightenment ideals for the benefit of whites was a violation of the Enlightenment's most fundamental principles, that humans had certain inviolable rights qua the idea of humanity. It must be noted that in this first stage, the hope isn't reasoned because the facts of American laws suggest that hope is reasonable. Rather, the hope was reasoned because blacks were bearing witness to the birth of a nation in a supposed age of reason. The facts in this first stage are more ephemeral but no less significant. The West had committed itself to the recognition of human rights. That was an ideal with wide currency. Blacks' hopes were tethered to the possibility that reason in the age of reason would allow white supremacists to acknowledge their humanity, thus put an end to slavery and its myriad abuses. It goes without saying that blacks were not naive about this hope. It wasn't as if slaves and sympathizers thought the matter merely depended on an analytic category mistake, as if a slave owner would one day say, "Oh, now I get it, blacks are humans, so let's treat them appropriately." Of course not. Yet, while slavery can be seen as in part the result of the failure of rationality or of capitalism's corrupted drive in providing free labor to maximize profits, slavery can also be seen as a result of genuine disgust and distaste for black bodies and contempt for black souls. Nevertheless, the surrounding environment of debate and persuasion that was the hallmark of liberal governance provided a source of reasoned optimism, no matter how slight. Indeed, this is how the debates over emancipation were grounded. Moreover, if slaveholders cannot be directly persuaded, then maybe enough of the rest of the population could be compelled to recognize the sins of their co-citizens. Yet, there was a failure to achieve the desired goal of full human recognition. It is crucial that we understand the nature of this failure. I above said that the failure of hope sometimes can be a function of hope that is poorly placed, or incompletely articulated, or susceptible to bad luck. But none of these really apply in this case. Importantly, the hope was instead confounded. That is to say, rationality, capaciously understood, and reason were warped and twisted in such ways that whites persisted in making the case that blacks were legitimately and sufficiently inferior to denigrate and marginalize them in all the ways they had been. The ultimate instance of the American hope being confounded for blacks in the first stage is the glory of slave emancipation, followed swiftly and decisively by the collapse of Reconstruction and the rise of Jim Crow. A refreshed and adopted system of black segregation, oppression, disrespect, and in many instances, outright murder in the form of lynching. It is little wonder Frederick Douglass was intent on shaming his audience members on that 4th of July. Yet as truly awful as the outcome of the first stage was, we may yet think that something more disturbing has been happening to blacks in the second stage. As the white gentleman pumped my arm after my own Douglasian moment in Greenwich, Connecticut, and told me not to be so down because things aren't as bad as they used to be, I could feel myself tense up inside for two reasons. I felt this man was a genuine idiot to say something so grossly inappropriate. I also tensed up because I was in Greenwich, a bastion of white privilege. I felt neither safe nor secure in my liberty to tell this man to tell him something not nice, though I am very certain I would have been justified in doing so. Why? Precisely because he was fairly oblivious to my insecurity, that my hopes could be confounded at any moment despite the success I have achieved. To this man, it seemed to be a fact of the world that our society is a better place than it used to be. Now, in some ways, things have, of course, changed. One of the genuinely momentous events of the 20th century was the passage of the Civil Rights Act, the law that finally was supposed to settle the question of blacks' equal standing in American society by equalizing every right held by white citizens. That I can today get on the bus and sit where I please with supposed recourse to the law to protect me is change. That we have a black president or had a black president is change. I'm not willing to let Obama go yet. He's still my president, so. That people do not hang blacks from trees with impunity, well, much anymore, is change. That a white police officer can choke a black man to death on video and escape prosecution is certainly a change from lynching, but in what world is that progress? That a police officer can drag a helpless black girl around a pool or a classroom is only a change of terrorist venue from the backwoods of the South to the environs of contemporary social life, but that is not progress. Don't get me wrong, there's something to be said for the fact that blacks are experiencing some success in making the issue of accountability visible. But consider how pitiful that standard is. After 374 years, now people are saying, hey, blacks really weren't kidding. They are being terrorized. You see, what you now witness on YouTube has been a fact of our lives since this country was founded. Only now it is quite impossible for you to ignore what has been happening, though many efforts are being made to deny the significance of these events. Simply observe the swiftness and ferocity with which Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Eric Garner were transformed as superhuman villains, while Sandra Bland became the Reagan-esque welfare queen, reincarnated, because she expected the officer confronting her to provide her an explanation for her being stopped and questioned. She was demonized for asking for decency. So, what can we say about a society that has changed but has not made a great deal of progress in respecting blacks and black lives? Well, it has confounded blacks' hope at nearly every turn. Let me emphasize the following point. Though blacks' hopes at nearly every, though the issue of police conduct is a bleeding headline that led our national news until our recent catastrophe, it would be a further injustice on everyone's part if this came to be the representative issue regarding racial inequality. As murderous as the trend has been, many more black Americans suffer daily under a stupendously wide array of inequality and mistreatment. Inadequate housing and discrimination, subpar education opportunities, oppressive state institutions of which the police are only one, insecure access to quality medical care, job discrimination, wage inequality, representational inequality in movies, media, the news, and on and on and on. When one takes stock of the robustness of racial inequality honestly and in good faith, it becomes immediately apparent why I say that blacks' hopes have not only failed in important respects, but have been confounded. And the reason is so elementary to seem ridiculous to say, but here it is. Racial inequality just shouldn't exist. If we are committed to a capitalist society, for example, we ought to accept that there will be inequality in wealth holdings. Some people don't have as good ideas as others, some people work harder, some people are greedier and value money for its own sake, while some are happy to make a living wage if they can't pursue other interests, and so on. It just is part of a capitalist system that it not be egalitarian with respect to wealth. But it is not a part of a liberal democracy that some people systematically experience obstacles to their flourishing and well-being simply because of the color of their skin. I'll say that again. It is not part of a liberal democracy that blacks be worse off just because they are black. This is why I say blacks' hopes are not simply failed but are confounded. When we observe the content of our laws, when we observe the structure of our legal system, when we observe the mechanisms by which politicians take office, there is nothing intrinsic to any of those features to stipulate blacks should be worse off categorically than most everyone else. Actually, quite the opposite. They suggest that blacks should be as equally well off as the best well off and as badly worse off as the worst well off, because they are people too. The fact that our inequality is so distinctly tied to our racial identity, which is itself a great and terrible fiction, indicates that our hopes are always under pressure by being undone by the irrationality of racism and America's racist history. Our fair observation of democratic governance and citizenship does not tell us the same story it tells other Americans. It tells us that we ought to be equal, but the facts of our actual history and the present day circumstances tell us that in many ways, American democracy was not built with us in mind, nor is it practiced with our interest mattering to anyone except ourselves. This persistent confounding is what makes the American hope for blacks a great burden. It is tempting to think that blacks should wise up and give up on hope in America, both in its people and its institutions, but this would be unwise, since that would mean relinquishing our humanity and not continuing to dispose ourselves positively to the future. This seems a double bind then, either give up hope or continue to play the fool and wish that someday fortune will shine her light on us and finally bring the enlightenment to American society. But I think this double bind is false. Though the title for this series of lectures has been Black Love and Black Rage in America, I have had almost nothing to say about love or anger, though these ideas have certainly been rumbling under the surface of the reflections this afternoon. But now it is time to bring them to the fore in service of saving the idea of hope, if it can be saved. Here's my basic proposition. Blacks ought to reserve the best of their love for themselves and their anger for everyone else in ways that can still contribute to the ongoing project of American democracy. I propose an economy of affect that prioritizes first, black care of the self, and second, constant and unrelenting protest in ways small and large, personal and institutional, until American society is racially just. It seems to me that blacks' ultimate acquiescence is taken for granted in all cases of injustice. I say this with all due respect to the many thousands of people on the ground in local communities every day across this country protesting and performing acts of civil disobedience. But there's a hard truth of the matter. Everyone possesses the conviction that there are limits to what blacks will do to put an end to our marginalization. Maybe that's true. If it is, then the possibilities of our changing society for the better exist, but are not likely to eventuate in major change in anything approaching a swift fashion. Every year of racial terror since 1964 is proof of that claim. If that is the case, and I believe that is the optimistic view, then we need a source of sustenance to weather continued confounding of hope, a means of keeping in view a vision and imagining of a racially just society. I've always preferred James Baldwin's model of love over Martin Luther King Jr.'s. Baldwin believed blacks should love whites, not for white's sake, but for the sake of their own humanity. But I've come to wonder if even this is too much to ask and too high a price to pay for a problem we didn't create, even when that love is not for white's sake. It demands that we nevertheless take stock of the absence of redemption in white America and factor that into our emotional and ethical makeup. It seems quite time to me that everyone else pay attention to the absence of justice for Black America and for them to factor that into their ethical makeup and for them to generally struggle with how they sound when they speak, how they look when they walk through our neighborhoods, and so on. And maybe the way to do that is to let loose with the anger a bit more. Surely this is tricky business. Blacks are already stereotyped as aggressive and deviant. It seems unwise then to say that anger should be deployed more readily. Except that when I say anger should be deployed more readily, I also have in mind that it should be deployed more intelligently. For example, on June 17, 2015, white terrorist and thug Dylan Roof entered Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church and without warrant opened fire, killing 9 innocent worshipers out of hatred and stupidity. Yet, just days later, representatives of the families and community held a conference in which they forgave that man. Why? Some say doing such a thing shows you are the better person, but I am unconvinced. Indeed, a key message in the blues tradition is that one can recognize the ugliness in life, yet live gloriously because one refuses to negotiate with that ugliness. This, to my mind, was a moment for intelligent anger, to gather before the national media and not do what was expected by invoking the idea of love in a confused manner, in my view, and rather stand firm and say, no, this is not okay, and in fact, enough is enough. Forgiveness will not be forthcoming until more is done to prove you have earned it for all the acts of terror that we have endured. We will not be the first to show mercy and grace. Clearly, nothing in that forgiveness was worth very much as measured by the black churches that have been burned down this country ever since, and of course prior as well. If my position makes you uncomfortable, it's not because it is ill-considered, but does so precisely because it is a stance so seldom taken up in a deliberate manner after yet another tragedy, in a manner that conveys the calm yet intense gravity of one's discontent. If that position makes you uncomfortable, it indicates just how thoroughly black acquiescence is taken for granted. Similarly, the black teacher that stood by in South Carolina as a white police officer dragged that poor black girl around the room in a way I would never imagine doing to any animal had an opportunity to express anger and rage. He probably did not out of prudent fear, but that is my point. The time for fear is past because racial inequality depends on our fear and hesitation in telling white Americans that they can't talk to us in certain ways, take certain things for granted about our attitudes, act as if my willingness to shake their hands absolves them of the sins of their various biases, as if reading Ta-Nehisi Coates' books and tisking while telling their friends in Starbucks how moving or powerful lyrically it is redeems their moral laziness. It's time for anger. Though this is the third lecture in this series, my previous comments and those I have offered this afternoon in many ways just scratch the surface, so I apologize if they're not entirely satisfactory. I understand if you find what I have said unsatisfactory, but there is a lot to be said at this moment when a lot is going on for a society that doesn't seem to fully realize how far away it is from its ideals. 40 minutes of philosophical argument can hardly pay the bills. My main aim, however, has been to try and resituate certain familiar ideas in different, intentionally provocative frameworks. My provocation is not put forward for its own sake. Rather, it represents my conviction that there is too much at stake to deploy a moderate imagination and that humans are capable of too much to accept the stifling effects of immoral habits and customs. I suppose that is funny. It sounds like I have a lot of faith in humanity. I prefer to say I have hope. Thank you.
Thanks. There's so much to think about and to discuss, and I wonder actually if I could ask you to say a little bit more about a term that was present in the talk, but was not one of the terms that you focused on, and that was America. And at one point early on, you talked about hope as envisioning possibility for the nation to achieve greatness, and then this idea of American hope, returned a number of times, and I wonder why keep the language of America and why invest hope in a national project, particularly in light of the history that you laid out so forcefully. What work is it doing, and are there reasons to think that not only is it not something to hope for, but something that may be part of the political project you're talking about ought to be dismantled?
You should answer a question, but can I ask what is the alternative you would be imagining if we abandoned that language?
Well, I think part of what I'm asking about is not about whether or not to imagine an egalitarian society elsewhere, but if the project of American democracy has chattel slavery and genocide at its core, are there ways in which retaining that language and that way of understanding what our hope is maybe trap, perpetuate an unwillingness to face up to the kinds of things that you've been talking about?
Yeah, so here's a point actually in favor of what you're thinking about when Manchild says, "Make America Great Again." To those who went to my June talk,
I think you're giving him too much credit.
No, maybe. When we say "Make America Great Again," it actually seems to have the content of all the troublesome things you're speaking about, because he wants to go back to an era that a lot of us are like, no thanks, right? So that's actually a point in favor of what he wants to be thinking about. But as you probably know, I fashion myself more and more kind of pragmatist in this regard. And so I think a couple of things. One, to relinquish the language is to relinquish ideals we actually do like. And so it strikes me as a bit of kind of fleeing the ground just because someone else has made it nasty. But it's something redemptive in the idea of it. So that's one response. Two, in a very kind of crude tactical sense, I think it could be remarkably difficult to get people to kind of think about what we're doing together if we abandon certain terms like nation in America. But then the third thing I think is that, and this ties more to the first point and the second point, this is a more substantive argument, I think, is that we can still deal that language like refashion how it's deployed. So I think just very simply, Audre Lorde spelling America lowercase a, for example, right? Which was the whole game for her in some ways, right? It was the way to say that we're not growing yet, right? We're not at full political maturity, and it's still a project very much in the making. And I tend to think, with respect to the second point about how to get people to kind of hook into what we're doing collectively, I tend to lean toward a position that with that tactical consideration in mind and the idea that we can refashion that language we do intelligently and forcefully, that we can still use that language in ways that could redeem the ideals we in fact do want to keep. Now, that's to say, I mean, ultimately that position could just be, that could still be too naive, but if you're asking me what my argument is for it, I think, I don't think that the terms have been so muddy that we can't make good the content that's often implicit, even as somebody like Manchild comes along and tries to re-imbue it. And if there's, to the extent that we could be an empiricist, the fact that approval ratings have gotten so low is it one heuristic I like to think is that people don't agree with what that vision of America is supposed to look like. So, but then again, maybe I'm being too naive about that. That's the position. That's my response.
You mentioned that a lot of people should, I guess, respond more intelligently. What did you mean by that? Is it through our articulation, through the timing of when we choose to get mad?
Maybe. So I want to make sure I make sure points clear. Deploy anger more intelligently, not to act more intelligently globally. That means something different, I think. But to deploy anger more intelligently. Let me give you a different example. I gave a talk at UPenn December 2014, and I was there talking about imagination, and I have to tell you something about the argument for what the story I'm about to tell you makes sense. The argument was part of the project that Nick mentioned about, and it was very basic, the argument in its essentials. I argue that one path to racial equality is that white folks have to imagine what it's like to be black in America. It's an ethical argument, right? And so I gave the talk. It's important that I mention this. The gentleman who brought me down there was a kind of southern Midwestern guy. He had done this program with bringing scholars of color to prominent universities when he was in Wisconsin. Then he was at Penn. I was his last speaker. He was very proud of himself for having accomplished this. Like, no, my body in his office was proof of his redemption. I need to put it just that way. But why did I put it that way? So I give my talk, I meet with a bunch of people like I've done today. I go back to that hotel room. Incidentally, in my hotel room, I have to tell the story. I'm walking back to my room, and I'm kind of comfortable today, but when I cleaned up, I dressed nice. And so I had cufflinks on, I had a tie, and I'm dressed cheap. And this white guy comes out of his room and says, excuse me, I need towels. And I turn around, everybody's an adult here. I said, what the fuck, I'm dressed? Because I was really pissed off. But then it got worse in a different kind of way. I go to my room and I check, my phone, and Daniel Pensley has been exculpated. Now we all saw that man did on YouTube. It's like not even a matter of interpretation. It's not a mystery. He choked Eric Garner to death, and they let that man free. And I was completely beside myself. I tearfully texted a friend of mine and said, "Protect your little boy. This is not a decent place." But I had to go to dinner. I had a job to do, so I go to the dinner. Now, Penn is an Ivy League school, and there was only like one other black guy there, and then some other colleagues, a couple that I respect, that I've known for a long time, but mostly white folks, and this dean. So we're sitting down, and he says, there's just something I can't wrap my mind around. Pro tip. When everyone begins to question with that phrase, nothing goes right afterwards. Whenever someone says, there's something I can't wrap my mind around, everything goes down. But there we go. So he says, one that I can't wrap my mind around. You think what I need to do to be racial justice, to imagine what it's like to be you. And I'm like furious. I have the Garner thing in the back of my mind, but I'm working. And I said, yeah. He said, huh. You think you know what it's like to be a white guy? And I calmly said, yeah. And I was kind of hoping he just dropped it, but arrogance was unstoppable. And he said, prove it. I said, I'm sitting here with you, aren't I? Joe on the ground. Now, I said that because I was one of 2 black people there, and I'm not supposed to be there. But to get there, I had to think like him because I'm not supposed to be there. I had to work my way there. And that was a moment, right? I didn't hit nobody. I didn't hit nobody. I didn't even raise my voice. I spoke in probably the most muted tone I can. Of course, you're at a restaurant, you can't be too animated when you're my size. People get nervous, right? But the table came to a complete stop because of the way I expressed. Like he wasn't gonna take any shit from him. So there's lots of ways to express anger. It isn't only about the protests in the streets. That's important too. But sometimes the most intimate moments or the most powerful moments set somebody straight. It isn't always about the big shows. It's about what happens right in front of you, right? And there's no reason why we have to play nice about that. I'm not saying to walk around like ready for combat, but someone really disrespects us. There's no reason why we have to kind of, right? Let's not appear in the way they're expecting us, right? There's ways you can forcefully demand that respect, and that's to me one of those instances where anger was intelligent. Does that make any sense to you?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes.
I'm sorry. I speak to everything on Facebook, so yeah.
Thanks for a great talk again. So this is related in a sort of follow-up to the last question. So here's one critique that you get sometimes of virtue ethics traditions is, well, what do you do? Well, you do what the virtuous person does, and then it gets challenged on the front of sort of action guidance. There's a sort of, well, perhaps virtue ethics as a tradition isn't sufficiently able to give us the details of when we should behave a certain way, because we get this kind of vague characterization of just what the virtuous person does, and then there's a lot of different ways of filling that out. With something like rage or anger, it seems very important to use it in the right locations and not the wrong ones.
Sure.
And I'm wondering if there's more to be said on your sort of virtue ethics-based account on how people can continue using anger in the right locations and prevent them from using it in the wrong locations. Because if, say, people that aren't as socially adept as you start using anger in the wrong locations, perhaps there's even more pernicious consequences that follow. So I'm just wondering how to get more narrowed in on what the theory should tell us here.
All right, so point number 1, I'm not that socially adept. Just watch me. That's point number 1. If I understand your question right, I think your question is how might the virtue ethics tradition help us be more discerning about? Okay. So the first thing to acknowledge is that and there's always fallibility. And that's one of the things that scares people about affect, right? But there's always fallibility in how these things go. But it's the same kind of fallibility about when to make an argument calmly, right? I mean, it can be misfired because the person that's situated properly to even listen to reason. So in that regard, I don't worry too much because things can misfire. That's what it's like to be human with other human beings, right? But now let's drill down a little bit more. So part of the virtue ethics tradition, for example, among many things, is the ideas of friendship and sympathy, for example. Now here's where me and Baldwin walk closely, right? And this is the thing I always found remarkable about Baldwin. Let me just put it very crudely. Baldwin was in a rage and didn't like white people very much, but he loved them. Because he thought, on his view, we were all involved in the American project and he loved them as kin, right? And it's the reason why everyone can read him and be moved by him, because he takes that really, really seriously, right? Why am I saying this? Because Paul wasn't a philosopher in that regard, where he's building on traditions to make sense. But now let me overlay a kind of analytic argument about this in a broad sense. The reason why this works for him is because he took the ideas of sympathy and friendship seriously, right? Sympathy in terms of what it takes for people in racially fraught society to be able to connect in any way, and friendship as the moral motivation to be sympathetic at all, right? And again, not that he was in any way naive about what was happening. He himself had been thrown in many police basements, beaten and bruised, right? So there was nothing like, he wasn't speaking from a point of privilege from far away, right? My point is that ideas like sympathy and friendship allow us to kind of tune in to the people with whom we're engaging, right? And it gives a certain kind of perception, morally, aesthetically, about the temperature of the moment, for example, right? And like I said, we misfire, right? But this is the work. That's really the ethical work, that we should all be doing in all cases, right? But that's the ethical work in these moments where I knew in this particular moment, in that regard, I could do no wrong by doing what I was about to do. Even, to be honest, I think he was kind of feeling me out for a job. I was never contacted again after that. That's okay, I did all right for myself, right? But this is part of, right, this idea of sympathy and friendship. And of course, there could be other things, right? But I'm just giving you kind of an example, right? The virtuous person is always trying to figure out who and what they are among other people, trying to figure out who and what they are. That's why, the blues and jazz, these mean a lot to me, because we're always in the act of co-creation, whether or not we know it. Being more aware of it, I think, allows us to not miss the beat, to not hit the sour note, to not play at the same time somebody else is meant to be playing, or play in harmony, for example. These are all metaphors for just thinking that what we do is not what a lot of analytic liberals think we do. I give a position, you give one, I give one, you give one. We're doing it together in ways that sometimes are messy. We can make sense out of it if we're paying attention in the right kind of way. That?
Yeah, that's good.
That was very good, right?
If you're allowed a follow-up, it's just that I was wondering about a contrast maybe between virtue ethics and something like consequentialism or deontology, where they're going to give you particular prescriptions of what the right action is, and it just seems a little murkier on the virtue ethics.
And I suspect this was, and I'm just speaking about this disciplinarily, I suspect that's the reason why it had a real kind of low point for so many years, right? But I want to suggest that its murkiness is what makes it demanding. Right? There's nothing easy about living morally with other people, because people are a pain in the ass sometimes, right? There's nothing at all easy about it. And what I think philosophy often wants to do is try to make things so clean as to give us the right answers in so many situations. And it can't always be done, not when it comes to this kind of problem. And I'm not saying that those views have nothing to offer. All I'm saying is that at least from this tradition, there's some real valuable insights to be drawn from. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm just wondering in your discussion if you think that the word alienation would be helpful. In other words, when in your discussion, I'm sorry, I don't know your name. Najat, in your discussion to her answer, you made me think about, in your answer to her question, about the notion of alienation or feeling harmed, right? In a variety of ways. And in some ways, with the talk you just gave, that dropped out. So it was such a really helpful answer. And I'm just wondering, you think of that as alienation, what leads to the anger, right? How would you describe that? What words would you use? What are people missing from not understanding that anger?
So I don't mean to suggest that alienation can be part of, right, how that happens, right? It could be alienation, a feeling of betrayal, just pure disrespect. I think it's fine to think about it in terms of alienation. The only concern I ever had about the idea of alienation, and I don't think it's necessarily a consequence of it, I think it has more to do with how people sometimes sloppily use ethical language. But I often think that people say alienation and that there's some finality in that, right? I've been alienated, thus there's been a rupture, and now we're done in some way. I'm not saying all people, I think that's sometimes an unfortunate consequence of that. Doesn't necessarily mean that like people who do what we do should like abandon the term. And so maybe I should pay more attention to it, because I fully concede that alienation can be part of the moment. So the story I told to John, that wasn't a moment of alienation. I felt that was a moment of arrogance plus disrespect, right? in that moment. But other moments, you know, it could be something different. Like if I deal with colleagues who always act as if they disrespect me, and then they say something completely that they would never say to anybody else, for example. Right? But you have some more answers over here.
Well, I'm just trying to, I mean, there's a way in which anger gets built up.
Yeah.
I mean, in other words, all the things that you talked about didn't sound like they were unique, you know, a one-off
Right, that's right.
thing, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And so I'm trying to think of, there are certain experiences, there's that lived experience that we have, and then there's anger that comes out over here, and there's a process of getting to that. And I'm trying to think about that connecting experience and how you could thematize that in a way that would be more readily accessible to people, so that they would think, of course you're angry.
So,
right? So just the facts and the anger, you see what I'm
let me walk with you on this. So your idea is something like there are these events that happen, and we know we're going to get to anger, but one way to bridge the event to the anger is through an idea like alienation, right? Which has a lot of content about our relationship to other people.
and America.
I mean, I think I am perfectly willing to go along with that. The only point that I would, and I know you're not making this point, so I'm just saying it, thinking out loud with you, is that I would to not represent that as the thing happening, right? As that's the only bridge to walk to anger, right? There's other ones, but I get your point is well taken. I appreciate that. Yeah. Sure.
If I could, I'd like to make a comment about the last couple of things.
Yeah, no, it's a philosophy lecture. You do it all the time.
So my comment is, I'm listening to these last few bits and thinking that the conversation is very sort of philosophical, but that the resolution has got to be deeply personal.
Okay.
And I just, as somebody who engages in introspection, let's say, my sense is that intellectual resolution is pallid compared to that really coming to terms with the actual experience you're having, and that's, it just happens not in the brain, it happens in a deeper place that somehow needs, we actually can't talk about it that much. We just have to direct ourselves to go into that space where that resolution can happen.
Yeah, no, I appreciate this. And so what I'm going to say, it sounds like I disagree with you, but I actually do agree with you. What I disagree with is not what you're saying, it's how you're positioning the process of what philosophy does, for example. So that's what I want to kind of emphasize. So I actually do agree with you about introspection and it being personal in many ways, not in all cases, but in many ways, of course. And I also agree that often philosophy can unfortunately be in the head. The kind of work I've been trying to do, which is why I also write publicly, and I read somebody like Baldwin, is because I actually don't think I'm not saying all philosophy has to be kind of like matters of the heart or anything like that, but I do think especially in something like interpersonal ethics, especially when it comes to something like race or gender or sexuality, I think philosophy does an injustice and a disservice by often abstracting a great deal of our experiences in ways that dislocate these matters from the heart, as you say. And I say it's a little phrase, but the reason why I do read Baldwin is because he's working in the opposite direction. In my reading of Baldwin, he writes because he has to work it out for himself, and he's just letting you sit with him as he does it, right? I think philosophy can do that as well. I've been trying to model, at least the work that I do, I'm certainly the only person, to in some sense kind of erase that disjunction, because I think that philosophy can be the kind of thing, I think it was always meant to be the kind of thing where that's right, when it's stereotype, to sit and get clear, right? And I don't think anyone can ever hold the position that you can only get clear in the head and ignore how you're feeling about a situation. Maybe Conrad, he was such a loveless person, right? But so I agree with the sentiment. I just want to defend some aspects of philosophy because I think it doesn't have to be that way.
Sure.
So thank you, I appreciate it.
Can I make a question?
Oh, no, go ahead.
My question is sort of changing the conversation a little bit, so you might not want to go there. In this very partisan, very politicized, sort of especially post Citizens United kind of world, terms of hope, I see, geez, we're kind of getting to be an oligarchy here. And when we are an oligarchy, underclass, you know, people against whom there's anger and hatred are going to take it even harder. You know, like, what about that?
So if I'm understanding your question, that if I put it kind of very plainly, we have reasons to think that an idea of an optimistic future for American democracy is under a great deal of pressure. Is that what I'm understanding?
More pressure today than
So I have a lot of things to say about this, and I'm willing to admit before I say it that I could be proven wrong about them. And you understand why I'm about to say what I'm about to say. I'm trying to make it clear. The first thing is, I think there's no doubt we're in danger, and I think there's no doubt about that. I'm sorry if you voted for Man-Child, but there's no doubt about that we're in danger right now. There's no doubt about that. The paper emphasized that we can have, even without progress, we get change, right? And I gotta be honest. I'll fight for racial equality in the way that I know how until I'm blue in the face. But I've never had to cut a black body down from a tree. And lots of us haven't, right? But a lot of people older than us know when that was a routine way of life. And we can't dishonor what that is, right? Again, I'm not saying that, I wouldn't be up here if I thought everything was fine. And I think we are in a scary moment. But we have to honor real differences in life, right? And I hold on to something like that, what I've just said, as a source of, this doesn't have to be this way. A second point I want to make, I made some noon talk, so people who heard this earlier, I apologize for the repetition. But I liken our current situation to something like a virus. Some viruses stick and they kill. But some you treat, and the treatment causes a brief backlash against your body, fever spikes. But then it goes away. Now history is long, but sometimes I think we can't get farther without him and what's happening now. This is what happens when you've had a black president and a woman candidate. You're gonna get this guy, no matter what, because the virus has to fight back a little bit, but it's gonna die. And I don't know which one it is. We're not there yet, right? But that's not an unreasonable analysis of it either. That being said, here's my third point. In my skin, I just can't give up hope. For example, I can't make sense of the Afro-pessimist condition, which people heard me say at noon. Because it means that if you're really pessimistic, stop talking about it and leave, right? You go. But in my skin, being in this country, I either have to give up hope, right, and leave, or get it done and start a revolution, or just shut up, or try to see if I could bring to pass other people's minds the better image for tomorrow. I started to go to conferences, and I have to put it this way, I have a lot of white colleagues who are more radical than that when it's time for revolution. Interestingly enough, their bodies won't be the first to go. Not even close. It would be me. I can't responsibly take up that stance, not being fully convinced that is the last way out. And I say all of that because part of what I'm expressing is really imposed position, I think reasonably grounded, but I could be proven wrong about all of this, right? But so when you ask me about what do we do about this given what we are living, this is how I have to frame it for myself. Also, I can't go on. Or else I can't go on. It's really like I can't go on otherwise. I'm sorry,
Thank you for your remarks. I'm really very moved by them. I was thinking especially of the story that you started to talk with, and then the one in the hotel, and then later on. And it made me think about the phrase cognitive dissonance. And I was wondering if you had any comments or thoughts on the inherent and imperative cognitive dissonance that white people have. Their cognitive actions, their beliefs, their conceptions of themselves and the nation, and they can look at you in a suit and say, bring the towel. Is it possible for that to be fixed or changed or healed? And if so, how?
And I want to make a number of things clear. I'm not speaking kind of like these absolute categories. I'm make it sound like, oh, I have a white friend.
None of my best friends are white,
No,
so
no, no,
sitting
no.
right next to her, you can
No, no, no.
ask her. We are friends. Totally white.
I'm speaking very seriously. There are a lot of people who are morally upright who fully get it, right? And then, and I'm proud to know these people. Then there are some people who will never, ever. There's nothing you can ever tell them. You know, I think about the movie Crash, for example.
I couldn't watch it, so I've heard a lot about it.
Yeah, no, it's worth watching in some regards. You know, I'm not sure how well it's aged, but I like the racist cop. I know it sounds crazy. No. I like. You know why? He's absolutely clear as to why he believes what he believes, and he's willing to tell you, and that's it. We know what we're dealing with, right? There's those people. That's it. The minds and hearts that I want to fight for is everybody else. No, right? Everybody else, right? And not we, but we thank man-child for letting us know how many people can I not fight for? 33%. That's who I cannot fight for. Because after a year of what he's done, they continue to think he's doing the right job. Now I know, right? It's everybody else, and the fact that it's the middle, this middle, right? The interesting about this middle is that they know what the principles are. They know why the principles should be held. They consider themselves to hold it. But they can't quite live fully and we're in a relationship to it, right? But that's an important confusion, right? Talk about, this is where philosophy can be, I mean, not only, but this is where it does its work, right? Trying to figure out, right, where that confusion between, as we like to put it, between practical reasoning and action, right? Intentionality and action, right? How that's formed, right? The 33%, they can keep themselves. I don't need them, and we don't need them. To be perfectly frank, and I'm not trying to be mean or cruel, but that's just the way it is. It's those people that middle group that knows what time it is, but can't seem to ever get anywhere on time, right? But right, and I'm not saying this in a therapeutic or maybe therapeutic, not a paternalistic fashion, but right, insofar as it's a co-participatory scheme, right? Those are the people, right, you want to fight for. Those people Baldwin reaching out to. Those people I want to be reaching out to. And again, I say this, and I'll say this again. I've said this about a dozen times. It could be wrong. That's the reason why this is all built on a certain kind of hope. But what I've just laid out in laying out those three groups, I think I have grounds for it. What? They'll have to prove that I was just completely off the rocker and open to them. I'm not ready to take that. So.
Thank you.
Hey, what?
I have a question about forgiveness.
Yeah.
And when do you forgive? And is it only something that is to be handed out when something is proven, or you think that it's deserved? And where does that spiritual intellect come into play? Kind of like what you were talking about. There's practical things to do it in ways in which that are intelligent to channel your anger through, but that spirituality part of that, is that somehow below that practicality level? And kind of in context of Martin Luther King Jr. and him being a preacher, and where does that whole spiritual wisdom come into play?
Man, you want me to write a paper on the spot? So a number of things. One is, right, I think it's not a good idea to treat forgiveness globally. Like to have some macro principle about forgiveness that works for all cases. Or maybe you can have a very general macro principle, but it'll come with the pressure in instances. So I just want to say, I think forgiveness is a very multivalenced idea. Two, I can give you an ethical argument about when I think is the right time to forgive under certain circumstances. And what I began laying out in this paper, in this lecture, was, at least in cases of racial offense, I think forgiveness I think the barrier should be extremely high at this point. But my reasons are, given where we are in history, what we fought for, the conversations we've had, there are certain things we're enduring that we shouldn't have to endure anymore. And I think the bar should be extraordinarily high, right? But from the point of view of interpersonal ethics, we have friends or colleagues who generally really are, and I'm not even speaking about race right this moment, and they miss that. And there's also something cruel about setting a high bar for forgiveness when there's a genuine misstep, right? Because then you become something like a moral dominator of some sort, right? So the thing is not about forgiveness itself so much as the kind of moral executive powers to kind of assess what I'm working with right now. Bill and Ruth, never, right? The person in the cubicle across from me who says, "Hi, good morning" to me happily every day, but that one time really feels bad about having said something sideways. Do I want to treat him like Bill and Ruth's, right? I mean, is he part of the historical problem? Right? But this is where our kind of moral intelligence has to come into play. And that's a very unsatisfactory answer in some regard, but on the spot, improvising with you, that's how I tend to think about it, which is what makes, again, what in response to the gentleman back, makes moral life so difficult, because there is no template for activating a judgment the same way each and every time, and it'd be justified the same way each and every time.
So, I have a question that I've been struggling through much of the talk to formulate better, and I've failed, so I'll just kind of throw it out.
I'm not fair. No, okay.
So you can say, oh, that's a stupid question if you want. But as you were talking about hope and kind of framing hope and sort of situating hope, I couldn't help but think about Obama in 2008 and the very huge amount of work that hope used as an emotion in his rhetoric and in the kind of collective political emotional life of the country. And one account is that there was some set of disenchanted folks who said, you got my hopes up. It makes me want. I mean, so do you see that use of hope as, what do you see as the relationship between that use of hope and some of those effects, and how you're thinking about hope? I mean, because one possibility is that the same word, but fundamentally different concept, or maybe there's more connection there.
So there are a number of things. So I know it's kind of like, at the Black people's meeting, which we all hold in secret, we never speak about Barry badly in public. I think a lot of people, I think on the most simple, I think, appropriate simple thing to say, he's a politician, and he's going to build a brand. It was a really great brand. I want to say more generously and sincerely at the same exact time, that there are kind of different deployments and levels of hope. And ironically, even as Obama kept, black sites going, drone incursions going, did the Cosby-esque finger wagging at black folks, which he did, and it was a shameful thing as far as I'm concerned. There's something to be appreciated, especially now with our current situation, and that is, I do believe that at the end of the day, he had a vision of what it meant to govern as a decent person in service of people who should be aiming for decency. And it's only in retrospect I could really see the value of what it took to be that genuine ambition. I'm saying that because now when I think about hope, I give hope for Obama. I think the bar might seem radically low, but now given what we're going through, I think he really thought if we could just kind of aim for just a kind of general decency in how we deal in good faith, right, we get a better society, right? Now, of course, even in 8 years, there's only so much you're really going to do, right? But there's a currently witnessing what we're seeing now that there was really, I think, really something to that. I think all other things being, still being in place, not ignoring the troubling things he did. I do think that at the core of what he was doing, I mean, he inherited a country and a history. It wasn't like he created the drone strikes. I mean, there's a whole infrastructure in place. I do think that he was working as best as he could to make good on the idea of what it means to govern for a decent society in the name of a decent society as an aspiration. And I think we haven't had that in a really long time. So I think in that regard, the idea of hope was working for him, that we had this American tradition. Somebody like him, with Milton Hussein, even with all the racism, can become president. I know it sounds very kind of hokey, but I think this is how he was thinking about it, that those things aren't nothing. They aren't nothing. And I think he was trying to use these as kind of grounds for thinking there's something we could reach for, even if it seems out of our reach. I have nothing to say about how close he got to that ideal, what that ideal really looked like for him. But I think that was the framework.
Well, and I mean, I also was thinking of that. I mean, so you articulate some of the critique. Well, you know, the drone strikes are still there. You're, you know, pushing this sort of crypto-conservative, not so crypto-conservative kind of racial lecturing, but also the critique from the kind of racist right, saying you promised us racism would be gone and now it's not. And I wonder, I mean, if you could go back in time and, you know, advise Obama, right, would the deployment of anger in the kinds of ways you're talking about, which, you know, something is famously not.
I want him to live, no.
Right. I mean, but that raises, I think, for me, like, it makes me wonder, like, so yes, I mean, certainly, I am with you on the deployment of anger in the sorts of ways you talked about, but does that scale up?
Yeah, in some ways it does. And so here's what I think. Here's as a kind of aside. Those who are Key and Peele fans who watched the roast where Key is Obama's anger translator. That was some really beautiful shade he was throwing at everybody. That was just excellent because he was basically saying, I can't really tell you what I really think all the time. I do think he had a chance to express more anger, but not in ways that typically, right? So for example, when W. Bush won re-election, first thing he says, I have political capital, I'm going to spend it. The thing that always puzzled me, even in the name of decency, was that Obama wanted to redistribute it to everybody. Hey, let's all get involved, like, you know. And I get the thinking behind that, but at some point, like, the person who's the leader, like, has to look. That's how power works. And again, I know it was part of his shtick, so to speak, to kind of trick everybody thinking he wasn't exerting power, even when he was. But I do think he had more opportunities that he could reasonably justifiably have said, look, what's going to happen is going to happen, and there's going to be a way I'm going to make the system work for it, whether or not my opponents, and actually state it in such a way. Other presidents have never had that problem saying that, right? I'm a policy wonk. I can't tell you which ones and what moments, but I do think there were opportunities, at least in that tonality, where it could have been expressed as, I'm taking this over, to the extent that the president could take something and it costs us over, which it obviously limited.